Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is Ricardo Pena, and in this video, I'm going to be going over some of the recitation rules for the prayer. So the first three rules are pretty simple, but the rules after that get a little bit more complex. So I'm going to be using the whiteboard to go over it. All right, let's get started. So really these recitation rules revolve around when do you recite something out loud versus when do you keep it silent. So I want to solidify that for you. The first rule. So we have sunnah prayers and nafil prayers, what we call nafil prayers. So sunnah prayers are those prayers that are offered either before or after one of the 5 obligatory prayers. As an example, for the Fajr prayer, the morning, the dawn prayer, there are 2 rakat sunnah that you would pray as extra credit before the obligatory morning prayer. So the morning prayer, the obligatory morning prayer, the Fajr prayer, requires 2 rakat, 2 cycles to complete that prayer. But if you want to do the sunnah, the extra credit, you would do 2 rakat of a prayer before the actual official obligatory prayer. Now, all of the 5 obligatory prayers have a certain number of cycles of rakat that are pretty standard. And there's differences of opinion on how many on some of them, but they come before and after. These are extra credit. They're not required, so if you just did the 5 prayers, you're fine. Highly recommended to go and learn the 5 daily prayers. It's highly recommended to learn which ones are the sunnahs for the 5 daily prayers because you get a tremendous amount of reward for it. The next one, the nafil prayers, those are kind of extra credit as well, but they don't revolve around the 5 obligatory prayers. So nafil prayers are prayers that are offered by following the structure that we're learning here. And you can offer them at any time for any reason whatsoever. These are called nafil prayers, and they're basically voluntary. So the sunnah is the practice of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and nafil prayers are basically just any prayer at any time. And those nafil prayers, you could choose how many cycles you want to pray. You could pray 2, 3, 4, whatever you want. The next rule. Those are the prayers. Let me get into the rule. For these prayers, the entirety of the prayer is silent. Okay? So when you go up for Allahu Akbar, you recite Surah Fatiha, you bow and you say Sami Allahu liman hamda. All these pieces, the entirety of the whole prayer for sunnah and nafil are silent. So when you're at the mosque, at the masjid, and you see people praying and you don't hear anything, they're either doing a sunnah prayer or a nafil prayer. Okay? So these are entirely silent. Rule number 2, the obligatory prayers. So for the 5 obligatory prayers, the change of position So what is the change of position? It's when you say Allahu Akbar and you change position. Now when you're coming up from the bowing position from ruku, it's Sami Allahu liman hamda. And that's the only one that's not Allahu Akbar. Every other change of position, you say Allahu Akbar, except when you come up from bowing, you say Sami Allahu liman hamda. Not Rabbana walakal hamd. That's not part of the change of position. That's what you say after you change the position and you get into the standing portion. For the change of position for all obligatory prayers, it is always recited out loud. So that's the rule. Pretty simple. So for the sunnah, nafil, the non-obligatory prayers, the entire thing is silent. For the obligatory prayers, when you change position, it's always recited out loud. Now the third rule, the third of the simple rules, is on the taslim. What is the taslim? The taslim is when you are finishing the prayer and you say, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So this is when you complete the prayer. That's the taslim. That one is always out loud for the obligatory prayers. Now remember, for the non-obligatory prayers, even the taslim is silent. But for the obligatory prayers, changes of position and the taslim are always recited out loud. Okay, so the fourth rule is in regard to Surah Fatiha, Ameen, and any additional Quran. So if you remember, when you say Allahu Akbar, you do the initial takbir when you stand up or when you start the prayer and you're standing in the standing position. That's the point that you recite Surah Fatiha, and when you're finished, you say Ameen. Now, it's optional to recite additional Quran, although highly recommended. But because it's not absolutely required, and this is a crash course to get you praying as soon as possible, there will be memorization videos for the Surah Fatiha, Ameen, but there won't be any memorization videos for any additional Quran. So once you get your prayer solid, you become a total pro. Highly recommended that you carry on and memorize some of the short surahs of the Quran for starters so that you can tack it on to this part. So on with the rule here. So when do we recite Surah Fatiha out loud? So the first thing you want to keep in mind is only in the first, let's make that up, only in the first 2 rakat. Okay? So that's a pretty easy rule. If you're in the first 2 rakat for one of the 5 obligatory prayers, then that is the only time it's possible to recite Surah Fatiha, Ameen, and additional Quran out loud. If you're in the 3rd or the 4th, then you're not going to be reciting Surah Fatiha, Ameen, or additional Quran out loud. Now here's where it starts to get a little tricky. You recite Surah Fatiha, Ameen, and additional Quran out loud only for the 1st, the 4th, and the 5th prayers. So the first prayer is the dawn prayer, Fajr. The 4th prayer is the sunset prayer, Maghrib. And the 5th prayer is the evening prayer, Isha. So if it's the first or the last 2 prayers, and you're in the first 2 rakat, then you will be reciting Surah Fatiha, Ameen, and additional Quran out loud. A quick rule here about the additional Quran is that you'll be reciting additional Quran only in the first 2 rakat. Okay, so that's another quick rule, which actually doesn't have to do with Is it silent or out loud? It's do you recite it or not? So if you want to add the additional Quran, you would do it for the first 2 rakat, not the rakat after the first 2. Which brings us to, when do we recite silently? Always in rakat after the first 2. So if you're reciting the 3rd or the 4th, then it's always silent. This part you recite always silently. And also, if you're in the 3rd and 4th rakat, then you will be reciting Surah Fatiha and Ameen only. In addition to that, you always recite Surah Fatiha, Ameen, and additional Quran silently for the 2nd and the 3rd prayers. So the 2nd prayer is Dhuhr, and the 3rd prayer is Asr. This is the noon prayer, and Asr is the mid-afternoon prayer. So these are really kind of the 2 middle ones in the middle of the day. For those, this is always recited silently. So another way that you can remember this is, for the 2 middle prayers, noon and mid-afternoon, really all you're reciting is, all that you're reciting out loud is the initial takbir, Allahu Akbar, and then the changes of position, and finally the taslim. Everything in between is silent for all the rakat, not just the first 2, all of them. Or not just the last 2, but the first 2 as well. And you recite Surah Fatiha, Ameen, and the additional Quran only in the first 2 rakat and only for the 1st, 4th, and 5th prayers. So that's kind of a lot. So let's recap this quickly in a little bit of a review. So rule number 1. First, the sunnah or the nafil prayers are entirely silent. Absolutely no part of those prayers are recited out loud. Number 2, for all of the obligatory prayers, all 5 of the obligatory prayers, the change of position is spoken out loud, in addition to the opening takbir. Number 3, the taslim, which is when you say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah to your right, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah to your left. These are always out loud for the 5 obligatory prayers. Now, number 4, Surah Fatiha, Ameen, and additional Quran. The additional Quran is recited only in the first 2 rakat, but you do not tack on any additional Quran in the 3rd or 4th rakat. You recite Surah Fatiha, Ameen, and additional Quran out loud only in the first 2 rakat. For whatever prayer of the 5 obligatory prayers you're praying, if you're reciting Surah Fatiha out loud, it will always be only in the first 2 rakat. You recite them out loud only for the 1st, the 4th, and the 5th prayers, which are Fajr, the dawn prayer, Maghrib, the sunset prayer, and Isha, the evening prayer. Recite Surah Fatiha, Ameen, silently always in any rakat after the first two. If it's the third or the fourth rakat, then you recite Surah Fatiha and Ameen silently. If you're in the third or fourth rakat, you do not add any additional Quran. Finally, you recite Surah Fatiha, Ameen, and additional Quran silently, always for the second and third prayers, even if it's the first two rakat. So, for the Dhuhr prayer, which is the noon prayer, and the Asr prayer, which is the mid-afternoon prayer, then you never recite Surah Fatiha, Ameen, or the additional Quran in any rakat for the whole prayer. And that's it. You have to kind of know those rules. This is also in the spreadsheet that I'm posting with these videos. So if you need to review that, then you can do so by looking at that spreadsheet. I hope this was helpful. Don't worry if you mess it up. Eventually you'll get it. And especially if you're praying with the brothers and sisters and follow along, keep this in mind and it'll remind you as well. So inshallah, finally we'll be on to the memorization videos and I will see you there. Assalamu alaikum.